Once upon a time, the Mana series was a much beloved franchise, with a loyal fanbase who loved its games. I'm part of that group myself, as you may have noticed from my channel's visual identity, including my profile picture in YouTube. As a kid, and even through my teenage years, the Mana games were among my favorites, especially Trials of Mana, which was not called that way back then, and Legend of Mana. However, for years, even decades, the Mana series began to be treated more or less like an outcast when compared to other Square Enix franchises. Almost as if it was a kid bullied by their own parents, and the event that started this was the release of the World of Mana sub-series, almost 20 years ago. Until we finally saw the release of an entirely new game in the series last year, Visions of Mana, all that's been holding the series alive were a series of remakes, re-releases and gachas, basically keeping the franchise on life support. But what exactly was the World of Mana that almost killed the franchise? First things first, back in the 90s, the Mana series was one of the most prominent among Squaresoft's arsenal of amazing games, being one of the main representatives of the action RPG genre. It became popular not only for being a well-done action RPG instead of a turn-based, but also because of its beautiful art style, soundtrack, its high fantasy setting and the co-op feature, which was something really new for console RPGs. It all started with a Final Fantasy spin-off, released for Game Boy and called Final Fantasy Adventure in the US, Mystic Quest in the Europe, which should not be confused with the other Final Fantasy Mystic Quest by the way, and, in Japan, it was called SEIKEN DENSETSU, Final Fantasy Gaiden. It was a humble beginning, a portable game that played a little bit like Zelda but with much more RPG elements, like Final Fantasy. Its successor would be released on the SNES instead of being another portable game, and this time called simply Seiken Densetsu 2 in Japan, ditching the Final Fantasy subtitle, and in the West, Secret of Mana, also renouncing its Final Fantasy origins. This new game is often considered one of the best SNES classic with beautiful graphics and a timeless soundtrack, and it started to present a little more of the Mana universe. Also, it was the first to feature cooperative gameplay, meaning that you could team up with one or two friends to tackle on your journey together. Co-op would become a really important feature in the series, for a lot of people at least, but it wasn't until 1995 that we would see what the Mana series was truly capable of. It was then that the world finally met Trials of Mana. However, it took literally almost 2 decades for the game to finally see an official release outside of Japan, through the collection release on the Nintendo Switch and the 3D remake. So back then the only official name it had was Seiken Densetsu 3, the original Japanese name. This game had a very cult following in the West because of a fun translation. Many fans of the series, including myself, played it thanks to this legendary translation. Here in the West, it was sometimes called Secret of Mana 2 for the lack of a better name. For practical reasons, I'll just refer to it as Trials of Mana anyway, since it's now the official name. This game expanded a lot on every aspect of the previous game, presenting a complex world building with a war raging through the realm and letting the players decide their own party of 3 among 6 of the heroes. Each one of the heroes was from a different kingdom, and playing with different parties would allow you to know what was happening on each place of the world during this war. Back then, this was an amazing concept, and honestly, even replaying it today, I still think it's pretty awesome. The game also expanded the lore around the Mana Tree, the sprites, the benevolence, a lot of which would become recurring themes on the series. It's pretty sad that the West never got to play this through official means back in the 90s. This was the last official numbered game in the series for years, with the next game being Legend of Mana in the PlayStation 1. Which in Japan was called Seiken Densetsu, Legend of Mana. I'm always mentioning the Japanese titles here because they are important for later. If you pay attention, you'll see that, this time, the name in Japanese is not numbered. Even though Legend of Mana is the 4th game released, it was not part of the official numbered series, so it can be treated a little more like a spin-off. It also presents a slightly different gameplay, although it's still action-focused, lots of weapons with different skills, a world to be built by the player, crafting, pets and a lot of systems in a game that was almost completely non-linear and with a quest-based progress. Seriously, this game was very experimental. Some people hate it, but overall most people seem to have very fond memories of it, me included. The idea of being a spin-off with different systems from the original series could be a very good thing. However, it was a prelude for something much worse. The World of Mana subseries. After some years lying dormant except for one remake that I'll mention later, the Mana series finally made its glorious return in 2006, announcing a new subseries during the E3 of that year. They even presented a trailer showing what was to come, and the original trailer can still be found on YouTube even to this day. So, to better understand why this series almost killed the entire franchise, first we need to understand something. It sucked. Thanks for watching. No, I'm just kidding. Partially. It kinda sucked indeed. But I'm here to talk about why it sucked and why it had such a negative impact on the entire series. I'll try not to be too harsh on these games, and I know that somewhere out there are people who love these games, and I'm pretty sure there may even be someone's favorite game. I won't judge, seriously, you're free to have fun with whatever you like. Also, I'm aware that these games also have their qualities, and I'm not gonna ignore them. Well, who knows, maybe I'll even end up changing my opinion on them until the end of this video. But let's get to the point. A lot happened after the release of Legend of Mana. The new generation started with the release of the PlayStation 2, Squaresoft had become Square Enix, there were new portable consoles with the release of the Nintendo DS and the PSP, and therefore many more possibilities. That was also the time when Square Enix were putting in motion their new business model, referred to as polymorphic content, in which they basically wanted to spread their content throughout as many different medias and genres as possible. If you're a Final Fantasy fan, that's also the reason why the compilation of Final Fantasy VII got a shooter game, a mobile game, a PSP prequel, a movie, anime, and a lot of other stuff. They intended to do as much as possible, and the Mana series was one of their first guinea pigs on this new model. To explore every part of the series, I decided to check humanity's greatest source of knowledge, the fandom wiki, and then use it as a checklist. There, I found out there were many more things besides the 3 World of Mana games I already knew. Going deeper on my research about these other titles, I came across this actually amazing website called SEIKEN, which had a very late 90s or early 2000s feels, even though it has up-to-date info on every release of the series. And that's because this site is originally from 2001. Isn't that amazing? Fan sites like these were really common about 20 years ago, but most of them disappeared after social media and huge sites like IGN and others took over. Anyway, I'm just mentioning here because I found this site to be a great source of information about the franchise. So, back to the checklist. I'll cover the main World of Mana games and talk about the other entries a little bit, with the first one being Children of Mana, exclusive for the Nintendo DS and released in 2006. When I first saw this game, I thought, this is it, this is a good Mana game, alright. I mean, the visuals are pretty for the Nintendo DS, this time even featuring an anime-style opening. It's an action RPG and not only features co-op gameplay, but this time it's actually the main focus of the game, with 4 players co-op. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in the beginning, apparently nothing. I loved the first hours of this game. This time you get to choose between 4 different characters. But unlike Trials of Mana, they are not really that different from one another. Everyone uses basically the same weapons, and while their backstories may differ a little, in the long run it's the same basic plot for everyone. They do have different stats, being more focused on strength or agility or magic, but again, this doesn't really make that much of a difference here. But that's okay, I guess, we can live with that, right? Co-op is unlocked pretty quickly, so as soon as you create your character, watch the first cutscenes and complete the first tutorial dungeon, you will already be able to join your friends and go on your journey. Except, it's not really a journey, it's just dungeon crawling. But that's also okay, right? Dungeon crawling with your friends can also be fun. Before heading out though, you can explore the city, which acts as a hub during the entire game. There you have access to stores that sell supplies and equipments, NPCs to talk to and get some information, lore and even side quests sometimes. The spirits are also present in town, you get to choose one to accompany you during your journey, and it will act essentially as the magic your character can use, meaning that depending on the spirit you choose, your character has access to different attack and support magics. Between each dungeon, you can talk to them again in town and change which one will accompany you. Then you can leave town and go to the dungeon. There is no exploration, you just click on the dungeon you wish to go. Now for the dungeon crawling itself. Right when you face your first enemies, you will notice that the combat system is slow, it feels heavy and not in a good way. Also, all of the dungeon floors consist in finding an item and finding the exit. Your bottom screen has a hint on where to find both or what to do to make them appear. That's literally what you'll be doing the entire game. The first dungeons have 4 floors, which is pretty quick, a few minutes, get in, get out, go on with the game. However, as you progress through the game, you will start to find dungeons with 12 and even 16 floors, and this can take a long time, believe me. This really starts to get boring and repetitive, especially considering you can't leave and return to the same floor, or even save midway through them if you're playing multiplayer. All you can do is take a rest every 4 floors before continuing. And for the co-op system, if you play with your friends, you will notice that the game has a friendly fire system. Not that you can actually damage your friends directly, but you can knock them down or even make them bounce around the dungeon, hitting enemies and objects alike. And I'm gonna tell you, this is funny on the first times, but it gets old really quickly. What the system does essentially is assure that you and your friends will stay away from each other to avoid this, meaning that you will end up playing together but not really. Also, the progress made in the game is only saved in the host system, meaning that every player who joined the host will leave only with their XP and loot, but won't make any progress in the story. I wouldn't see this as a problem by itself, considering the dungeon crawling nature of the game and how it expects you to replay dungeons multiple times for more loot. However, if your friends don't advance their stories too, they'll be in a huge disadvantage, since unlocking weapons that are essential for beating some enemies and bigger gem frames, which is essentially how you build your character's status and skills, all of this is locked behind story progress. Long story short, even playing co-op, everyone will have to progress through their own story modes, either alone or tackling the same dungeon for each player, one at a time, so that everyone can have access to their character's essential upgrades. Again, this is another thing that gets annoying and boring pretty quickly. To be honest, that's the main issue with this game. There's a lot of small problems that would be completely ignorable by themselves, but when you have a lot of things that get boring pretty quickly, it doesn't take long for the game to become a core. Even the menus in this game are so convoluted that even navigating through them gets boring. As much as I was having fun at the beginning of this game, halfway through it I was just wishing everything was shorter and quicker. In less than 3 hours of playtime you will already have seen all that the game has to offer, and after that you will just repeat everything, but with everything taking longer to complete. The real disappointment for me here is that the older games had already done a lot of these things right, and many of these things could just be literally copied in this game and it would come out better, especially considering that of the original World of Mana games, this is the one that looks and sounds the most similar to the classic Mana games. The story doesn't really do any good for this game either. It's so basic and generic and does so little to actually expand the universe of the series that most of the time it's even hard to keep paying attention to what everyone's saying. The worst part being the villain, the Mana Lord. Edgy villains are not exactly new to the series, but this one takes the crown. Every time he appears he just babbles a lot of edgy stuff and then gets his butt kicked immediately. He always comes out revealing his genius plan to a few minutes later find out that everything went wrong, and sometimes not even because of the hero. I just couldn't help but laugh at how helpless the poor guy was and even feeling sympathetic towards him. Just wishing he would do at least one thing right in his entire evil lord life. For the first World of Mana game, this wasn't looking really good, but then 1 year later came Heroes of Mana, also released for the Nintendo DS, but in 2007. Now, remember what I said about polymorphic content earlier? Heroes of Mana is where it becomes explicit. Although it was released on the same system as Children of Mana, this game departs completely from the Mana formula. Instead of being an action RPG like every other entry in the series, this is a real-time strategy game. Yes, on the same veins as the Age of Empires or Warcraft series, but much more simplified. This is probably the most unexpected genre to show up as an entry in the Mana series, but Square Enix seemed eager to try it more than once back then, since they released the Final Fantasy XII RTS game too, also on the Nintendo DS. The objective here was to introduce the Japanese audience to a genre they aren't used to, and doing so using franchises that they already knew seemed to be the best course of action possible. Personally, I don't think that's a bad idea at all. This is not a numbered Mana game, it's pretty much a spin-off, so I'm not against the kind of creative freedom at all. I'm also not a hater of the RTS genre, but I'm not a fan either. I do enjoy some popular titles like Warcraft, for example. The matter here is that, as an RTS, this is just not a good game, like, at all. Just like Children of Mana, the early moments are enjoyable and make it seem like this will be a fun game, but as the game progresses, everything starts to fail miserably. As an RTS game, there is also no exploration here. Instead, the game progresses stage by stage, each new stage being a new map to uncover, new objectives, resources to collect, new structures and units to build. RTS games tend to be PC games for a reason, and that's because managing everything and controlling your units is way easier with a mouse and a keyboard than with a controller. That's where the DS comes in hand, literally, since you can control everything in this game with your stylus pen. That's not a bad thing actually, it works. However, every movement in this game is tile-based, and the same tile cannot be occupied by more than one unit at once. Not even to get across and reach another tile. As soon as your units and the enemy units start to clash in narrow spaces, and that will happen a lot, you will see how easy it is to get important units stuck and unable to flee when they're in danger. That is especially frustrating when it happens to NPCs that you have to protect. But they simply throw themselves in the middle of the fight and get surrounded by enemies before you can even understand what's happening. And that happens a lot. Even when you know what's happening but you're forced to watch them as you fail your mission, and you can't do anything but watch. The tiles problem also reach another level of frustration when you send your character to attack an enemy unit, but the enemy happens to be protected by other units or simply surrounded by your own characters. When this happens, you will see the character you sent trying to go around the entire map, and I'm not even kidding, the AI makes them go around everything in the map to reach the enemy from behind, and most likely getting killed in their paths or simply arriving when the battle is already over. Having to constantly pay attention to this kind of thing takes away the entire fun of the strategy and positioning, because you're always having to be aware if your characters are not killing themselves or taking strolls through the map. And that goes for your resource collectors too. It's not uncommon to see your collectors' units wandering around the map just because there were another 2 units collecting resources on the same tree or stone they were assigned to. There's not much to gameplay other than that. Later in the game you get the Benevolence as summons, and that's pretty cool. Also, talking about the Benevolence, this brings me to the story portion of the game, which is actually nice. I like this story here. As a matter of fact, the boldest move in this game is that it's actually a prequel to Trials of Mana, the third official game that I mentioned earlier in the video. And since Trials of Mana is my favorite in the series, it was pretty cool to see some events mentioned in that game happening here. And getting to play as the parents of some of the heroes from the other game is also pretty neat. Not only it shows characters from Trials of Mana in the past, as it also provides a lot of background as to what happened at some places in the game, including the elusive town of Peda. That was pretty much what kept me going until the end of the game. However, it's also pretty crazy to think about that, considering this game was released as a prequel to another game that, by that time, haven't even been released in the West, meaning that the main selling point of the story of Heroes of Mana wasn't effective here. Now, other than that, I can't really say I recommend this game. It also has some multiplayer features, but I couldn't really test them, so I don't know how they work and I just know they exist. Now let's check the third of the three main entries in the World of Mana series, which is Dawn of Mana, released for the PlayStation 2 in 2006. Yes, I know I went back 1 year in time and presented the games in the wrong order, but there's a reason for leaving Dawn of Mana as the last one, and that's because, supposedly, this is the most important World of Mana title, since its Japanese name is actually SEIKEN DENSETSU 4. It's a numbered game included in the main series, the first numbered game ever since the first release of Trials of Mana on the SNES. In other words, the first main Mana game in 10 years, and as such, it carried a huge responsibility. I kinda like this game, but I also hate it, but I like it. I'll get into more details here. Dawn of Mana not only was the first numbered title in a decade, but it also was the first 3D game in the series. And as we all know, not every game franchise had a smooth transition from 2D to 3D. Turn-based games had it a little better since they didn't depend a lot on physics and camera control. But since the Mana series has always been more action-focused, it was in the danger zone. Supposedly, this game takes place in the same world as Children of Mana, but 10 years prior. The producer of the series, Koichi Ishii, said this himself. However, he also contradicts himself when saying that these installments are totally unrelated to each other. So, who knows? The world map is presented as basically the same, so we're led to believe that there is, after all, something between these two games. So, first things first. The game begins presenting a lot of its core mechanics on a kind of too extensive tutorial level that will get you running around chasing the girl's pet, a rabbit called Buju. She's Ritya, a nature-loving girl that will tell you how every living being is important and should be protected right after you kill 100 of other creatures just to chase her rabbit. She could have told me that a few minutes earlier. Anyway, while you chase it, you will be introduced to the panic system, in which you have to throw things at the enemies to make them dizzy and then hit them again with your sword to gain medals. And these medals are essentially the leveling system in this game. You'll also be presented to the basic controls like jumping and attacking, camera and lock-on systems. There's a lot of things to talk about this topic, so I don't even know where to begin. But let's go. I think I'll start with the main issue here. Remember how the polymorphic content was about different genres and different medias? That being said, we should not expect Dawn of Mana to be a regular action RPG as one would expect from a Mana game, even though it's a main series numbered game. Initially, it may seem like that, only with a different leveling system using the dropped medals instead of experience points. But don't be fooled. This game is more on the action-adventure side, with lots of platforming elements too, and as such, it has little to no RPG elements. What do I mean with that? The medals you earn during the game on the levels they give you are all discarded at the start of each new chapter. So, yes, every new chapter you're back at square one, and has to start looting medals to power up your character once again. I find the medal system itself interesting and fun, but having it reset every time makes the game lack a sense of character progression, since not only that makes your HP and MP bars reset, but you also lose access to your spells and everything every time. To counter that, the game features an emblem system, which you can unlock doing certain things, pretty much like achievements, in-game, and then equip them between each chapter. But they're kinda limited and most of them are pretty hard to unlock on your first playthrough. In the end, you will just have to accept that you will be turned from hero to zero every time. Now for the panic system, which is how you get the medals in the first place. The game relies a lot on physics for you to try to interact with everything in the scenery and throw it at your enemies. I won't lie, it's really fun to do that, and trying to hit a lot of enemies and things at the same time is even more fun. However, a lot of times you will find yourself missing your target because of the clunky controls and terrible camera. And there's also many things around that may seem like throwable objects but really aren't. And this can get annoying when you find yourself surrounded by enemies. Now, I just mentioned clunky controls and terrible camera, right? If you put this together with what I just mentioned about the game being more focused on adventure and platform, you can see where this is going. There are times when it's just awful to move around because the camera goes crazy way too often. The lock-on system also doesn't really help, since it insists on locking onto enemies that sometimes aren't even in the same room as you. You even get a vine whip to grab things at a distance and throw around to hit your enemies, but since the camera and aiming are just so bad, what could be a really fun system ends up being simply frustrating. Fortunately, most of the time in most of the levels, at least in normal difficulty, you can get by even with all of this. Except climbing ladders. I don't really know why is it so hard to climb ladders in this game, but the character simply refuses to grab the goddamn ladder. Holy shit, I'm mad just by thinking about it. The combat is really simple, and during the first chapter after the tutorial, it is more properly presented since you finally find yourself a sword and you're also introduced to a lot of mechanics at the same time. The whip that I already mentioned, the magic system and the slinger shot, which you can use elemental ammunition to stagger your enemies. Although there are a lot of systems here, all of them are pretty basic. Attacking is just mashing up the square button, the slinger shot is just choosing the ammo and then shooting with R2, and the magic system is basically choosing the spell you want to use and pressing R1. It's all simple, but it does the job. I'm not complaining about it. With good controls and a good camera, there wouldn't really be a problem here. Level design is also fairly simple. Most of the time it's pretty linear. Go ahead, fight enemies, destroy stuff, reach the next save point, and in the end of each chapter you'll find a boss. Sometimes there will be levels that aren't that linear and they can be a pain in the ass. Especially one involving big mushrooms. God, I hate that level so much. There's also a chapter select if you want to play previous levels again, since the game is divided in stages instead of a world to explore. Halfway through the game, you'll also be presented to some of the most annoying bosses you'll ever see in a game. I can see what they try to do with these bosses, but again, the clunky controls and camera just get so much in the way of everything that could be a fun and different fight just becomes as fun as being constantly kicked in the balls. There's also an arena mode where you can test your fighting skills and patience against waves of enemies. It's kinda cool though, you get to have your own pets fighting alongside you, and the OST here features a number of songs from the older games remastered and orchestrated. Now, I know I just basically trashed the entire game, but even so, I do kinda like it. As I said, the panic system is fun and during most of the time it can be enjoyable, even with the game's flaws. The visuals are also beautiful and the soundtrack is very worthy of being part of the series. The story is also good enough, could be better developed and less rushed, yes, but it's not bad. The game is also kinda short, something around 10 to 15 hours, depending on how you play it, so it also doesn't overstay its welcome. There's also multiple difficult levels with more emblems to unlock and a lot of replayability to get better ranks. However, considering how the controls and camera are already a huge difficulty themselves, I can't really imagine having any fun playing through the game again, but with harder enemies, and especially harder bosses. Gosh, they suck so much. In the end, I can't even exactly tell why I don't hate this game, but I even ended up having some fun with it, despite its flaws and not wanting to ever get close to it again. Do I recommend it? Absolutely not. As I said in the beginning, this game carried an enormous responsibility, being the fourth main game in the series, and a lot of expectations were put on it, since it was also the first console game since Legend of Mana, instead of a portable game like the ones that were released in between. With all that I just said, it's not hard to imagine how this game failed to live up to such expectations, having a bad reception even from, and maybe especially from, older fans. There were also many other action games, platforming games and even action RPG games already released for the PS2 that were a lot better, leaving Dawn of Mana fade slowly into obscurity as the last official numbered Mana game released for years to come. If the World of Mana subseries was the beginning of the end, Dawn of Mana was most likely the title that left the series hanging by a thread. And the release of Heroes of Mana 1 year later also didn't do it any good. However, it's not like the World of Mana subseries ended there. There are even more titles to be included in it. But these games can't be played anymore, and I'll talk about them now. Following the lists on the fandom wiki, the next one is Friends of Mana, released for mobile in 2006 exclusively in Japan. I don't have much to say about this one for the simple reason that I haven't played it, and most likely never will, since, as I just said, Friends of Mana was a mobile game, released exclusively for Japanese phones. Not only that, but it's not even available anymore. It had its services terminated back in 2011. Lasting 5 years is quite an achievement considering how long current Square Enix mobile games usually last, to be honest. The lack of information about it and inconsistency on the information we have in English makes it really hard to talk about it. What I can say here is that it was an online game and it took place in the same world as Legend of Mana, 10 years after its ending, and featured many characters from that game, besides mechanics like crafting, pets and fruit harvesting. The only places I could find actual information about this one was on the website that I mentioned earlier, SEIKEN's, and another one called Archives of Mana, which I'll also leave a link in the description. It's worth checking if you're really interested, as they not only have screenshots but also translated information and promotional content. I don't really have any more to talk about this, since I would basically be stealing the information available on Archive of Mana at this point. And I'm also kinda not interested in Dead Services games, and as sad as it is, this was just the beginning of something that would become more and more common through the next years, considering how many service games we see being released and even terminated in less than 1 year nowadays. Anyway, if you're really curious about this game, go on and check Archive of Mana and see the amazing job these guys did gathering info on this and the other Dead Mana games. Now for the next one. SEIKEN DENSETSU Mobile, again released for mobile only in Japan. Yes, another Dead game, and this one makes me even sadder since this one was a full remake of the first game, but in full colors. No online service, no gacha elements whatsoever, just a full single player remake with better graphics. Sadly, it was released only for Japanese phones from that time and never ported to any other platform or even modern smartphones. It became totally unavailable to play after its termination. This was not the only remake for the first game, Final Fantasy Adventure. It also received a full reimagination called Sword of Mana for Game Boy Advance, featuring full-colored visuals and adding a lot of elements that were introduced in later games, like recurring characters and tropes, some systems introduced in Legend of Mana, a lot of backstory for the main characters, including the possibility of playing as the girl, and even having slightly different storylines for each character. However, as I just said, Sword of Mana is more like a reimagination than a remake, since it changes so many things it barely resembles the original game. If that's good or bad, it's up to you. Later on, a new remake was released for modern smartphones and the PlayStation Vita. This time it was full 3D and was localized as Adventures of Mana. And it is pretty likely that it's because of this remake that SEIKEN DENSETSU Mobile was left in the past. Even though it was a 3D remake, everything here was much more accurate to the Final Fantasy Adventure than Sword of Mana. From the simple storyline to the old-school Zelda-like combat and exploration. It's almost 100% one-to-one remake, and again, if that's good or bad, it's up to you. Personally, I like having different options to choose, and as such, being able to play both Sword of Mana and Adventures of Mana, and then choosing which version of Final Fantasy Adventure I like more is already good enough. And that brings us exactly to the point here. I like having the options available. And I really wish we still had the option to play SEIKEN DENSETSU Mobile, seeing that it was probably the most accurate remake of the first game ever made. Maybe it had just aged badly, maybe it didn't have anything else to add to the original one except for the colors, but I'd sure love to play it for myself and then have my own opinion on which one's my favorite. Sadly, that won't ever be possible, and all we have left are a few screenshots and an old announcement on E3. This shows us how far Square Enix was willing to take the polymorphic content strategy. Not only portables and consoles, but even mobile games, even though they were nothing more than something very experimental back in the early 2000s. To the point of even making a single player and an online service game. And now, finally, the last installment in the World of Mana subseries. Princess of Mana, released for nothing. This one's actually a manga. Remember how I said the polymorphic content was about spawning different genres and even different medias? Well, there you are. Even a manga was part of the World of Mana subseries. It was written and drawn by Satsuki Yoshino, now famous for her work on Barakamon. The story took place 300 years after the events of Children of Mana, and it stars the descendants of Ferric, the main playable character from Children of Mana. That's pretty much all I could find about this manga. It was published from 2006 to 2010 and ended in 5 volumes. Apparently, it was also released in French. I couldn't find it anywhere to read it online, and the only places I found pre-owned copies for sale I had to import it. And it would be expensive as hell, so I couldn't really afford it. I mean, I don't even know if it's any good, but it's only 5 volumes. I was willing to read it if I could, but maybe one day, if it ever gets a reprint or a digital release. So, after all of that, we will talk about the aftermath of the world of Mana. After all that I just said, it's easy to see why the blame of the series' failure usually falls upon these games. A fun thing about the existence of the internet is how we're able to see almost everything that happened since its ascension registered for future generations to see. Of course, implying that content wasn't shut down for some reason. But I'm talking about this now because since you can find the first trailer for the World of Mana here in YouTube, uploaded back in 2006, it also means that you can check comments from back then. And guess what? There are fans of the series looking forward to these games, imagining how they would play, how they would fit into the franchise, and even getting hyped for them, only to be disappointed as they were released, one by one revealing itself as something completely different from what everyone expected. A generic co-op dungeon crawler, a platforming adventure with terrible controls, an RTS, Japan-exclusive mobile online game, and so on. Meaning that even its niche and loyal fanbase lost hope, leaving the series behind as merely a good nostalgic game they played back in the SNES or in the PS1, since these games were nothing like the Mana games they loved so much. And this brings us again to the term I've been repeating a lot throughout this video: polymorphic content. If anything, this business model adopted by Square Enix is really to blame for such failure. Sure, the Mana series is not the only one in which they applied this model. Final Fantasy was also one of its victims, but the main difference here is that Final Fantasy already had more than 10 games released, a well-established setting, universe and fanbase. Final Fantasy already had a strong identity built throughout many years and titles released. Everyone already knew what Final Fantasy was, so the idea of releasing a lot of spin-offs in different genres and systems didn't really have enough power to properly destroy the identity of the franchise. Instead, it could be a chance to expand it like they did with Final Fantasy VII, for better or for worse. Mana, on the other hand, had barely started to build its own identity, with only 5 games released, being only 3 for the main series, and 1 spin-off and 1 remake. The series was still taking its first baby steps and building not only its identity, but also its loyal fanbase, its own universe. We had barely seen enough of the elemental spirits, the benevolence, the sword and the tree of mana, to know what the series was really about. But then, it was introduced to this new pretentious business model, in which it would try to appeal to an incredibly bigger audience, expanding its universe so much to the point its already fragile identity was broken in so many pieces that it became hard to actually know what the Mana series was about, or how it should play. It was way too early to try and make something so ambitious with a series that, unlike Final Fantasy, was still finding its place. And the attempt to reach every possible place at once just ended up backlashing and leaving the Mana series with no place to stand at all. And most of the new players trying to get into the series through this game would most likely be confused, since they were so different from one another, and all of them so different from what came before. For the following years, the Mana series would just lay low, appealing to nostalgia as its only weapon to stay alive. The remake of the first game, Adventures of Mana, was the last hanging thread to keep the series from disappearing, representing a possible survival both through remakes and through mobile games. Speaking of which, a number of mobile games had been released meanwhile. After the aforementioned Friends of Mana, we had titles like Circle of Mana, Rise of Mana, and most recently, Echoes of Mana, released for smartphone. All of them had their services discontinued. Echoes of Mana was a gacha game appealing to nostalgia, and even so, it barely lasted more than 1 year. On the other front, remakes would still be released for consoles and PC. Secret of Mana Remake followed a few years after Adventures of Mana and was met with mixed reviews. The new 3D visuals was not so appealing as the original 2D sprites, and the gameplay had no more than a few updates, which was pretty underwhelming for a remake and made the game feel outdated already on its release. However, a new spark of hope had appeared in the horizon. In 2020, the remake of the third game arrived. Trials of Mana was totally remade and finally released for the entire world. And unlike Secret of Mana, this time it could be considered a proper remake. This quickly became one of my favorites of all times. It had the exact same feel as the original SNES version, but with new revamped 3D visuals and totally updated gameplay, adding a little more depth to the combats, but not enough to deviate too much from the original formula. Adding the ability to jump freely and consequently adding verticality to the exploration. New arranged versions of the already beautiful soundtrack, voice acting through the entire main story, lots of quality of life, new endgame content and new collectibles to be found. This right here was exactly what the Mana series needed in all of these years. This was the true transition from 2D to 3D that I always wished to see in this franchise. The only downside to this remake was that co-op gameplay was removed, which is sad, but it's also a little hard to implement considering how the base gameplay changed from the original version. Even so, this represented a new hope for the franchise, after spending so many years in life support. Trials of Mana Remake was not only a good remake, it was a great game in many aspects. It was a new direction for the franchise and proof that yes, it was possible to bring the series back and try to recover its lost identity with new elements. And so, a few years later, and with a remaster of Legend of Mana in between, we finally saw the announcement of Visions of Mana, released for every modern platform except the Nintendo Switch. Visions of Mana was announced and finally released in 2024. A totally new full-fledged game after so many years of mobile games and remakes. And more, Visions is actually SEIKEN DENSETSU 5, meaning that it's the first main series installment ever since the fiasco of Dawn of Mana 18 years in the past. It represents a glorious return after so long, and it clearly expands on what the remake of Trials did. A full 3D explorable world, but with a totally new setting, new characters, the return of the class system and a revamped combat system both working together with the elemental spirits defining the character's movesets, weapons, spells and status. I'm currently playing through it and, to be honest, I'm having a blast. Even though its budget is clearly mid and it's just a AA game instead of something grand, it's also a game that was clearly made with a lot of love. Much more love than ambition, and that's exactly the point here. A game made carefully just to be a fun game and not an ambitious project to move millions of dollars. Unfortunately, not everything can be perfect, and even though the game was fairly well received by players, the studio behind it was shut down right after its release. Apparently not because of the reception, but because the parent company, NetEase, had other plans for the future and single-player games were not part of this plan. I sure hope this doesn't spell another long dark age for the series, because after these last two entries, Trials and Visions, it's clear that the series is getting back on its feet, and the problem of lack of identity is slowly being solved. It would be a real tragedy if it ended like this, especially when things were just starting to look bright again. It will only prove that the series is doomed to suffer with poor choices from huge companies. So, this is it for the World of Mana, its origins and harsh consequences on a well-beloved franchise from the past. I know that even the worst games out there have their own fanbase, and that's also the case for the World of Mana games. I myself am not a hater nor anything, and as I said in Dawn of Mana, I actually kind of like some of them and do respect how they tried to be innovative in the series, even though they ended up being objectively bad games due to poor choices. And in fact, it's actually good that this fanbase exists and resisted through all the hardships in the series. If they didn't, Mana would probably have died back then and we wouldn't have seen the remakes and much less a new title. So if anything, we should thank those who liked and played the World of Mana games. As of 2025, unfortunately I wouldn't recommend anyone to try Heroes, Children or Dawn of Mana. Instead, just jump straight into Visions for something more modern or into Trials Remake for something that feels more old school. Thanks for accompanying me here through this rather lengthy video, and I hope you enjoyed this journey through the hardships of one of my favorite series ever. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and see you next time!